Hello, I'm David Brumley. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. In this video, we're going to look at Cryptography 101, the basics. And by basics, I mean the absolute fundamentals. I'm going to start out with a motivating example that describes a common scene where we want to use cryptography. I'm going to use this to explain the basic vocabulary like what a ciphertext is, what plaintext is, what are cryptographic keys, and then I'm going to describe a little bit of what public key cryptography is and what private key cryptography is. I want you to really just have an understanding of these terms. So we start out with the following motivating example. In this example, there's two people, Alice and Bob, that want to talk, and they want to pass notes back and forth, and these notes are private. For example, Alice maybe is wanting to send a note that says, "I like you. Do you like me?" And of course, Bob's reply is also potentially private. Now they're going to pass these messages across a public forum, for example, the internet. And the goal is to secure this communication. And of course, we have to be secure against someone. And the way we model that is we come up with an adversary. And we typically call this adversary or enemy Eve. This is actually short for eavesdropping. But in fact, Eve can do much more than just eavesdrop. For example, Eve may try to change the message. For example, instead of saying like, maybe what Eve does is tries to flip the message to say hate. That would be catastrophic. So the goal of cryptography is to protect this communication, to make it secure. So in a sense, we want to come up with this notion of a cryptonium pipe, where Alice stuffs messages in the cryptonium pipe and Bob pulls messages out. And they know that during transit, Eve couldn't read, couldn't tamper, couldn't do anything to these messages. So a classic definition of cryptography is really the practice and study of techniques for securing communication and data in the presence of adversaries. Really, it's the science of coming up with this cryptonium pipe. But it's not just about securing communication and data in the way we normally think of it. It can actually be much more. For example, cryptography is one of the backbone ingredients in a new internet currency called Bitcoin. So it's not just securing communication, it's actually creating a new opportunity for a new currency. Now, in order to describe how we come up with this sort of cryptonium pipe, we come up with something called a cryptosystem. And a cryptosystem consists of the different parts needed to communicate securely. And so at the core of the cryptosystem is an encryption program and a decryption program. And so the way a cryptosystem works is Alice encrypts her plain text message, which I have here represented by M, by giving it to the encryption program, and she also gives a key. And I have here labeled KE to denote it's an encryption key. So this plain text message, the original message, is fed into the encryption program, and out comes a ciphertext. And it's this ciphertext that goes across the public forum. And in fact, it's this ciphertext that Eve has access to. So Eve may try to eavesdrop or change the ciphertext or whatnot. So at the end of the public forum comes out another ciphertext. And I've denoted this by C prime to indicate we hope it's the same thing as C, but Eve may have tampered with it. So if Eve has tampered with it, it's not quite the same thing. This ciphertext we receive, Bob decrypts with his decryption program and his decryption key KD. And what will come out is the original plain text message M, or an error. And in particular, this error is very important. Error is the way Bob knows that C was not equal to C prime. And so error is, in a sense, what tells us if Eve has tampered with the message. Now, there's some important things to note here. First, in modern cryptography, the security of the system purely relies upon keeping the encryption and potentially decryption key secret. So the security relies upon the secrecy of the keys and nothing more. In particular, we assume the encryption and decryption programs are public. They're well known. Why? Well, history has shown that trying to keep the programs themselves secret is really actually dangerous and doesn't work out very well. So we try to reduce security to the smallest thing, which is really just this key. The second thing I want to note here is that I've said there's two keys. There's an encryption key and a decryption key. And in fact, in many classic crypto systems, these two keys are exactly the same thing. For example, this may be a shared password. We call this private key communication, or another word that you may hear is symmetric encryption. Of course, it's symmetric because both parties have the same key. It's also private. And one of the challenges with private key crypto systems is the fact that both Alice and Bob know the same key. So either one of them, by exposing the key, can break the security of the crypto system. In a sense, both Alice and Bob have to keep these keys well protected. One of the cool things that happened in the last few years is there's been crypto systems where KE, the encryption key, is not equal to the decryption key. And we call these public or sometimes asymmetric crypto systems. Now, by asymmetric, I mean that both parties don't share the same key. In fact, for example, if Alice wants to send an encrypted message to Bob, and one way of doing a public key cryptography scheme, KD is private, but Bob publishes a public encryption key to everyone. Now, Alice would use this public encryption key to encrypt something to Bob and know that only Bob can decrypt it because of certain mathematical properties that make it so that only the holder of the private key can decrypt those messages. So this really took off around 1974 when a variety of different people were studying this problem. With really Ralph Merkle was probably the earliest, but there are other people like Diffie and Hellman and RSA and even GHCQ, which is a British spy agency. So in real life, of course, we use both. We don't just use public, we don't use private, we actually use both public and private. And probably the most readily available example is HTTPS, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol with Secure Sockets. It's the protocol we use when we're communicating securely with our web browser, with a remote site. So if you see this little green lock here, what that means is that we've encrypted our communications with a server. And in particular, we've used public key cryptography, and often it's something called like elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. The actual name here is unimportant to remember, but we're using public key cryptography to help set up a cryptographic session, and then we switch over to private key cryptography to do the bulk of the encryption. And that has to do with certain properties of encryption schemes. In particular, things like public, for example, tend to be more computationally expensive than private key cryptography. But the important point here is we use both. We use both every day, and a great example is, just secure communication with our web browser between a remote server. So in summary, in this video we covered the basic ideas in cryptography. We covered this basic setting where Alice and Bob want to communicate securely, and there's an adversary, Eve, who's going to try to thwart this. We talked about ciphertext, plaintext, and keys. And I told you how there's two different types of cryptographic schemes out there that are distinguished by how they use the keys. In public key cryptography, remember, the encryption key and decryption key need not be the same, while in private key cryptography, they are the same. So with that, never stop hacking. I'll see you next time.